Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alan Hoffman. I am a trustee of the Weitzman National Museum of American Jewish History. And the Weitzman has the honor of organizing and leading the National Jewish American Heritage Month effort. To learn more about Jewish Heritage Month and find resources like a social media toolkit and lesson plans, you can go to jewishamericanheritage.org to find that. The Weitzman is located on historic Independence Mall in Philadelphia, a location that's rooted in the American and Jewish ideal of liberty and justice. We're catty-corner to the National Constitution Center, whose president and CEO, Jeffrey Rosen, you will be hearing from today. Our museum explores the American history through the lens of the Jewish experience. We feature both everyday Jewish Americans and those who have had an impact on broader American society, like Justice Brandeis, Steven Spielberg, and more recently, Justice Ginsburg, who were part of our Only in America gallery. As a Jewish legal professional, I'm pleased to be speaking with the Jewish legal community today, especially during Jewish American History Month. Indeed, my law firm, Blank Rome, was founded by two Jewish lawyers in 1946 because they could not participate as lawyers in a large firm in Philadelphia because of their religion. And I've been honored to follow in their footsteps, having served as managing partner and chair of our law firm for the past 15 years. Now, let me turn it over to our partners for this event at the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists. Richard Fulton is the executive director of our co-sponsors at the Jewish Voluntary Bar Association, and he will introduce our speaker, Jeff Rosen. Rhonda Lees is a vice president of the American Association of Jewish Lawyers, and she will manage the Q&A at the end of our program. So please put any questions you may have now or throughout our program in the Q&A future. Richard?
Thank you. Thank you, Alan. We're really pleased to be partnered with JAHM, the Jewish American Heritage Month, on this very important program. And as Alan has said, the AAJLJ is the National Voluntary Bar Association. We're dedicated to serving as the voice of and a resource for the Jewish American legal community. And I have to say that in these times especially, it's a very important role that has to be filled. One of the great benefits of working in Washington, D.C. is that over the years, I was not infrequently able to attend programs featuring Professor Jeffrey Rosen, whether as a keynote speaker, a panelist, or in conversation with no less a luminary than Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Zachar Lebracha. Now, of course, courtesy of Zoom, it is even easier to drink from those waters. Always, Jeff's remarks reflect his deep and abiding knowledge, not only of the specific provisions of the U.S. Constitution, but also of the themes that tie those provisions together. I'm honored to have the opportunity to introduce Jeff to this audience today as part of a program that is being offered appropriately enough as part of the celebration of Jewish American Heritage Month, or JAHM, as we affectionately call it. Jeffrey Rosen is the president and CEO of the National Constitution Center, where he hosts We the People, a weekly podcast of constitutional debate. He's also a professor of law at the George Washington University Law School and a contributing editor of The Atlantic. He was previously the legal affairs editor of the New Republic, I remember those articles, and a staff writer for the New Yorker. Jeff is a graduate of Harvard College, Oxford University, and of Oxford University, where he was a Marshall Scholar, and Yale Law School. In addition to his biography of Justice Brandeis, Professor Rosen is the author of a biography of Chief Justice William Howard Taft and wrote the New York Times bestsellers, The Pursuit of Happiness and Conversations with RBG. We are very excited to have him for this JAHM and AAJLJ program to speak about Louis D. Brandeis, American Prophet. Professor Rosen, please take it away.
Thank you so much. And it is wonderful to be with all of you. I'm honored to be hosted in collaboration with the Weitzman National Museum of Jewish American History, which is indeed our neighbor on Independence Mall in Philadelphia. And Alan Hoffman, thank you for all your great work with that great institution. And Richard, it's wonderful to see you. We have indeed interacted over the decades, and so meaningful to be back talking to all of you wonderful Jewish Americans and Jewish lawyers about the legacy of Justice Brandeis. So I've just published a new book about the pursuit of happiness, how classical writers on virtue inspired the lives of the founders and defined America. And it's an exploration of the classical moral philosophy that the founders read when they wrote that famous phrase in the Declaration of Independence, the pursuit of happiness. And I read the books on Thomas Jefferson's reading list that he said inspired the phrase, including the classical Greek and Roman moral philosophers like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, and the great Enlightenment thinkers. What I found came as a revelation. I learned that for the founders, happiness meant not feeling good, not being good, not the pursuit of immediate pleasure, but the pursuit of long-term virtue. And in particular, by long-term virtue, they had in mind self-mastery, self-reliance, character improvement, being your best self, using your faculties of reason to moderate or modulate your unproductive passions or emotions so that you could achieve the calm tranquility and balance that defines well-being and happiness. The book was a revelation to me. It changed my conception of how to be a good person and how to be a good citizen. I share this with you now because I learned in the course of my reading that precisely the same classical moral philosophy inspired Justice Brandeis. And the last chapter of the Happiness book explores the connections between Jefferson and Brandeis's philosophy of freedom of conscience and of self-mastery. And I came to see with even greater precision than I'd realized when I wrote the biography of Brandeis, how directly Brandeis was channeling these two great influences on his thought, classical moral philosophy, embodied in his favorite book, Alfred Zimmern's The Greek Commonwealth, and the political and constitutional philosophy of Thomas Jefferson. So what I'd like to do today is talk to you about how Brandeis, channeling the Greeks and Jefferson, wrote the greatest free speech opinion of the 20th century, the Whitney and California concurrence, how the same Jeffersonian and classical moral philosophy inspired Brandeis's discussion of the pursuit of happiness in the Olmsted case, and indeed all of his great Supreme Court opinions translating the values of the Constitution in light of new technologies. I'll then talk about how the same philosophy inspired the two other pillars of Brandeis's judicial philosophy, his insistence on deference to state experimentation as laboratories of democracy, and his crusade against the curse of bigness, as he called it, in business and government. And then maybe we'll wrap up by talking about how this classical Jeffersonian philosophy makes Brandeis the great apostle of federalism, liberty, and new technology in the 21st century, and then take your questions. So here's Brandeis on Jefferson as it came to Whitney. And it was just so exciting to me to see how over the summer of 1926, Brandeis read the Life and Letters of Jefferson by Francis Hurst, and he found Jefferson's original draft of the Virginia Bill for establishing religious freedom, as well as Jefferson's inaugural address. And in his concurring opinion in Whitney, Brandeis is distilling Jefferson's core understanding of the pursuit of happiness, achieving a kind of constitutional poetry. I'm now going to share with you the famous passage from Brandeis and Whitney that just distills the essence of his Jeffersonian and classical vision. I often recite it as a party trick because I've memorized it, and sometimes save it for the end of the show because it's such a great way to end. But I'll recite it now because it'll anchor what I want to talk to you about Brandeis's distillation of Jefferson. So here are Brandeis's immortal words, and listen closely to each sentence because it's deeply significant, and he's very closely following Jefferson in the Virginia Bill. Those who won our independence believed that the final end of the state was to make men free to develop their faculties, and that in its government, the deliberative forces should prevail over the arbitrary. They valued liberty both as an end and as a means. They believed liberty to be the secret of happiness and courage to be the secret of liberty. They believed that freedom to think as you will and to speak as you think are means indispensable to the discovery and spread of political truth. that without free speech and assembly, discussion would be futile, that with them, discussion affords ordinarily adequate protection against the dissemination of noxious doctrine, that the greatest menace to freedom is an inert people, that public discussion is a political duty, and that this should be a fundamental principle of the American government. Okay, let's parse each of those Jeffersonian sentences one by one. Those who won our independence believed that the final end of the state was to make men free to develop their faculties, and that in its government, the deliberative forces should prevail over the arbitrary. In other words, Brandeis is saying the revolutionaries of 1776, who were educated in classical principles of moral philosophy, believed that the purpose of government is to make individuals free to develop their faculties of reason, to ensure that reason prevails over passion in the pursuit of self-government. And Brandeis is constantly talking about the urgent need for individuals to develop their faculties. Throughout his career, he believes that the purpose of free time or leisure is to allow people not to work less hard, but harder in improving their faculties and learning and growing. And that is why he says that that's the very purpose of independence, to allow the deliberative forces to prevail over the arbitrary. He then goes on to say they believe liberty to be the secret of happiness and courage to be the secret of liberty. That's a quotation from Pericles' funeral orations, which Brandeis took from one of his favorite books, which is Zimmern's The Greek Commonwealth. He read that book in the winter of 1913. He said it pleased him more than any other book except Euripides' Bacchae. And he came to see Athens in the 5th century BC as the apotheosis of civilization, the time and place when citizens were freest to pursue happiness by devoting themselves to moral self-improvement. Brandeis is especially struck by Zimmern's definition of the Greek concept of leisure, which is time away from business, where citizens can be free to develop their faculties through lifelong education. Brandeis wrote to Alice, his wife, in 1914, "The Greek word for unemployment is leisure. What a happy land that." And he developed a similarly strenuous Athenian conception of leisure as time away from work that should be devoted to reading and other forms of industrious self-improvement. Leisure does not imply idleness, he wrote in a 1915 speech on true Americanism. It means ability to work not less but more, ability to work at something beside breadwinning, ability to work harder while working at breadwinning, and ability to work more years at breadwinning. Leisure, so defined, is an essential of successful democracy. In other words, leisure, as the Greeks defined it, is time we devote every day to the pursuit of self-improvement, which is synonymous with the pursuit of happiness. You see, I have behind me the Warhol print of Brandeis to inspire me to industrious self-improvement each day. And I do indeed think of Brandeis' strenuous conception of leisure, and that means every moment of the day that I'm devoting, as I'm tempted to do every minute, of course, to idle browsing and tweeting rather than reading and growing. I have Brandeis over my shoulder telling me to put down the blog and pick up the book and get back down to work. It's a very strenuous conception. It's very important to remember how essential Brandeis and the Greeks thought it was to use every moment of the day to learning and growing. Let's continue with Whitney. They believe freedom to think as you will and speak as you think are means indispensable to the discovery and spread of political truth. I found, of course, that phrase, think as you will and speak as you think, comes from the Roman historian Tacitus, who begins his history by celebrating the rare happiness of our times that you may think as you will and speak as you think. Tacitus's axiom appears on the title page of David Hume's treatise on human nature. It's quoted in Cato's letters and in Spinoza's theological political treatise. Brandeis could have gotten it from any of those places or from a famous letter from Jefferson in 1799, in which Jefferson defines intellectual freedom to preserve the freedom of the human mind then and freedom of the press. Every spirit should be ready to devote itself to martyrdom, Jefferson wrote, for as long as we may think as we will and speak as we think, the condition of man will proceed in improvement. It was exciting for me to trace that phrase back through Spinoza to Tacitus, and that was crucial for Brandeis and Jefferson. Brandeis's immersion in Jefferson's philosophy of happiness didn't end with Whitney. 2 months after Whitney, he reads Jefferson's works, and he travels to Monticello in September to pay homage to Jefferson. And he reads in 1927 a biography by Albert J. Nock, which celebrates Jefferson as the great libertarian. Brandeis calls the book the worthiest account of our most civilized American and true Democrat. He recommends that every kid in Kentucky receive a copy of the Nock biography of Brandeis. And Nock, who's a great critic of the New Deal, reminds us that Brandeis's progressivism is not statism. He really is a Jeffersonian libertarian. He is an enemy of the curse of bigness in government as well as bigness. And that is why he strikes down the first New Deal and joins those unanimous opinions of the court that hold that the first New Deal and the alphabet soup industries are a form of centralization. FDR is stunned by Brandeis's apostasy on this question. Even old Isaiah, he asks in disbelief when his advisors tell him that Brandeis has joined the court in striking down the New Deal. FDR had previously ignored Brandeis's warning to stop this centralization, but after the rebuke by the court, he heeds the warning. And if the first New Deal, as Arthur Schlesinger said, breathed the spirit of Herbert Croly and Theodore Roosevelt and the new nationalism, the second New Deal breathed the spirit of Woodrow Wilson, Louis Brandeis, and the new freedom. It's focused more on decentralizing power and on mixing public and private regulation so that freedom can be preserved. I'm struck also by how Brandeis was inspired by Jefferson, not only in his political philosophy, but also in his Pythagorean lifestyle. Pythagoras, the great Greek moral philosophy, who came up with the distinction between reason and passion, and distinguished between reason in the head, passion or emotion in the heart, and desire in the stomach, and said that we must use our powers of reason to moderate our unproductive passions and desires so we can achieve calm tranquility of balance. It's Pythagoras who recommends the daily philosophy of self-accounting before bed every night, asking how successfully we've moderated our emotions and achieved the classical virtues of prudence, temperance, courage, and justice that inspires both Franklin and Thomas Jefferson to draft 13 or 12 virtues that we should practice every day. Franklin drafts it and puts it in his autobiography. Jefferson drafts a similar list for his daughters. Virtues like industry, prudence, temperance, and justice. Says we should put X marks every night where we've fallen short. And it was this consonance between the Franklin and Jefferson list of virtues that really inspired my happiness book, because I was so struck that both Franklin and Jefferson had chosen as the mottos for their project a passage from Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, a book I hadn't read before. Cicero says, "Without virtue, happiness cannot be." And in a longer passage that Jefferson liked to hand out to anyone who asked the meaning of happiness, Cicero says, "He who has achieved the tranquility of soul that is characterized neither by undue exuberance or despondency. He is the virtuous man of whom we're in quest. He's the happy man." I share all this just because I now understand with greater clarity where Brandeis got his own Pythagorean lifestyle. He got it from Pythagoras and was also inspired by Jefferson. It consists in rigorous moderation in eating and drink. Jefferson and Brandeis are relatively abstemious and largely vegetarian and forswear hard liquor for modest wine and so forth. They're both devoted to physical exercise until their old age. Jefferson horseback riding and Brandeis hiking and canoeing on Cape Cod into their 70s and 80s. Both are very careful in guarding and regimenting their time, maintaining rigorous daily reading and writing schedules from their school days until their death. Brandeis, like Jefferson, rose before dawn. I had the honor when I was in law school, rather in college, of one of my, I had an independent study with David Reisman, the great sociologist who wrote The Lonely Crowd, one of the towering achievements of sociology in the 20th century, and Reisman was one of Brandeis's last law clerks, and he told me that Brandeis required Reisman and the other clerks to slip drafts of legal opinions under his home office door before sunrise. He lived on California Street in DC and had an office in an apartment upstairs. And Brandeis, who was always there before dawn, would silently retrieve the drafts without opening the door and then get down to work. He was really all about deadlines and all about self-mastery. He would also say, as Reisman reported, you know, the opinion is now accurate. How can we make it more convincing? And went through many drafts to be as precise and powerful as possible. Brandeis and Jefferson diverge in their personal economies, though. Jefferson is an aestheticized shopaholic. He can't manage his books. He leaves the presidency $20,000 in debt, and indeed it's Jefferson's avaricious greed, his addiction to a lifestyle of luxury and excess, that lead him to betray his principles of frugality, to refuse to free his own enslaved population until at his death, he passes them on to his daughters, and almost all are sold to pay his crushing debts. And it's Jefferson's avarice and refusal to give up the lifestyle that slavery made possible that leads him to betray his principles and to remain dependent on the lifestyle that slavery made possible, even as he purported to denounce it. Brandeis, by contrast, is the model of Athenian frugality. His income as a lawyer is $100,000 a year. It's more than $2 million in today's dollars. He spends only a tenth of it. He lives in a very austerely furnished apartment on California Street. He eats small portions of simply cooked chicken that Mrs. Brandeis would parcel out to the very hungry guest. Reisman said it was always arduous to go over there for dinner because you've got so little food. But as a result of this, Brandeis saved his first $1 million by the age of 30 and had $3 million when he died in 1941, an amount that surprised his acolytes. But he always viewed money as a form of freedom that would allow him to devote his free time and leisure to public service without seeking compensation. Brandeis had a Stoic view that surplus time and leisure should be invested on behalf of the public good. Brandeis sums up his Athenian conception of the pursuit of happiness in a famous 1922 statement to the Federal Council of Churches that amounts to what some have called his creed in essence. Always and everywhere, the intellectual and moral and spiritual development of those concerned will remain an essential and the main factor in real betterment. And foreshadowing his conclusion in Whitney that the founders saw liberty as a mean and an end, Brandeis says, the development of the individual is thus both a necessary means and the end sought. For our objective is the making of men and women who shall be free, self-respecting members of a democracy. Brandeis emphasized that personal self-government is necessary for political self-government. That's the crucial connection between personal and political self-mastery, private and public happiness. And Brandeis says that democracy is a serious undertaking that substitutes self-restraint for external constraint. Brandeis says that democracy demands continuous sacrifice by the individual and more exigent obedience to the moral law than any other form of government. It is possible only when the process of perfecting the individual is pursued. Isn't that remarkable? I want to really pause together over how strenuous Brandeis's Athenian conception of democracy is. It's not a freedom to let it all hang out, you do you, feel your bliss. It's very much different than the modern conception of happiness as seeking immediate pleasure. It's rigorous self-sacrifice, using each spare moment of our day and our leisure time to engage in this process of self-perfection. That's what Pythagoras demands. That's what Socrates demands. It's what Jesus demands. And it's what the Proverbs and Hebrew Bible demand in the famous proverb that Brandeis and Abigail Adams love to quote: "He who is slow to anger is greater than he who taketh a village." It's that notion of arduous self-mastery as being necessary, or else the republic isn't going to fall. Justice Ginsburg told me that her mom gave her similar stoic advice. Justice Ginsburg's mother, an immigrant on the Lower East Side, who was so devoted to reading that she once broke her nose on the street because she was walking down the street buried in a book. Such a moving notion, although dangerous when you're walking on the street. Her mom told her, overcome unproductive emotions like anger, jealousy, and fear. They will distract you from productive work. And it was that advice from her mother, which was also embodied in the injunction, be a lady and be independent. Being a lady meant have complete self-mastery and self-control. And that was what Justice Ginsburg did next. She was the most self-disciplined individual I've ever had the honor of knowing. Like Brandeis, she uses each moment of the day for productive work, carefully regiments her time, is so focused on her work that people could be around her in the room talking and she wouldn't notice and would look up in surprise because she was so totally tuned in. Like Brandeis, a very rigorous deadline enforcer, remarkably precise in her copy editing and attention to detail, but also always saving time for meaningful leisure, like the glorious music and opera that she was such a necessary part of her life. She would say that it took her out of herself. She couldn't think about work when she was merged in the music. And by carefully being mindful each moment of the day, she became one of the most significant Americans of the 20th century and transformed our understanding of gender equality and inscribed herself onto American history by the sheer self-disciplined force of her vision. So I'm sharing all this because I think that for Justice Ginsburg and for Brandeis, as for Jefferson, as for the classical authority, this process of self-mastery, of becoming more perfect, is a right, but also a duty. And it's something that they enjoined on all citizens. And they really had a sense that unless citizens on a broad scale took seriously this obligation to become more perfect and to engage in self-mastery, learning, and growth, then the republic would fall. It would succumb to demagogues and the mob, and all knew of the dangers of the Caesar on horseback, who would come and subvert the republic, offering the people cheap luxury and amusements, would lead the people voluntarily to surrender the republican forms and allow Caesar to set himself up as a dictator for life. I found this amazing letter from Jefferson to Madison when he received a copy of the Constitution. He said his two concerns were, first, that there was no Bill of Rights, and second, that the president was eligible for re-election, and as a result, a future president might lose an election by a few votes, cry foul, enlist the states who voted for him to support him, and set himself up as an authoritarian dictator. Remarkable warning, and very consistent with the constant fears of demagogues that all of these figures had in mind. The antidote was self-mastery and civic education. None is sure whether or not the republic will survive, but they think that the means of salvation will be education on a broad scale. And that's why Jefferson's greatest achievement that he puts on his tombstone is founding the University of Virginia, along with the Virginia Bill of Religious Freedom and the Declaration. He doesn't put his presidency on the list of the top three. And Brandeis, too, puts on his tombstone his great championing of the University of Louisville and its law school, where he's buried. And that faith in education and the demand for self-mastery are very important for us to remember today in these anxious times. I want to share one more Brandeis opinion as an example of his determination to translate the values of the framers in light of new technologies. Brandeis was a Jeffersonian in many respects, although not in his strict constructionism. Jefferson had a tremendous fear of the federal courts. He thought the state courts and the president and Congress should all be able to interpret the Constitution on their own, and any one should be able to enjoin a law from going into effect. And Jefferson was a strict constructionist who favored, in his opinion on the bank, a kind of rigid textualism and originalism that Brandeis eschewed. Brandeis talked about the importance of the living law and taking the values of the framers and making them our own in light of changes in technology and time. Brandeis's living constitutionalism, to use Jack Balkin's phrase, is perhaps best expressed in his great dissent in the Olmsted case in 1928, where that's the case involving electronic wiretaps, and a majority of the court holds that wiretaps don't violate the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, which prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures. Brandeis, in his dissenting opinion, connects the right to pursue happiness with what he calls man's spiritual nature. The makers of our Constitution, he says, undertook to secure conditions favorable to the pursuit of happiness. They recognize the significance of man's spiritual nature, of his feelings and of his intellect. Brandeis said the founders understood that material well-being alone could not bring the happiness that came from spiritual freedom and fulfillment. And this is Brandeis. They knew that only a part of the pain, pleasure, and satisfactions of life are to be found in material things. They sought to protect Americans in their beliefs, their thoughts, their emotions, and their sensations, conferring the right to be let alone, the most comprehensive of rights and the right most valued by civilized men. For Brandeis, as for Jefferson, the government should leave us alone so we can regulate our own beliefs, thoughts, emotions, and sensations in a quest for personal as well as political self-government. It's always so rewarding to go back to Brandeis's words, to read the primary text, and to see the precision with which he's channeling this classical vision of self-improvement and moral perfection. Olmsted is just another great example of his openness to new technologies and his determination to translate constitutional values in light of them. Remember, in Olmsted, the majority of the court, in a wooden but perfectly plausible opinion by Chief Justice Taft, says a Fourth Amendment violation requires physical trespass, citing the writs of assistance and all American law unto that date. And here, the government suspects a guy of using a telephone to make gambling bets and doesn't trespass into his office because they can just put the taps on the wires under the sidewalks that are leading into his office. No trespass, no Fourth Amendment trigger, says Taft, you're out of luck. Brandeis insists that we take into account not the physical violation, but the spiritual one. He has in his desk drawer a news clipping about a new technology, television, that his law clerk, Henry Friendly, has gotten for him. But Brandeis misunderstands television. He thinks it's a two-way technology where people can see each other on both sides of the screen. He anticipates Zoom, and he anticipates what we're doing right now. But Friendly says you can't look out of a TV and see someone on the other side. Now, of course, you can. So Brandeis, at Friendly's request, takes out of his draft the reference to television, but instead anticipates in this amazing passage in Whitney that ways may someday be developed by which it's possible, without physically intruding into desk drawers, to extract secret papers and introduce them in court. He's anticipating fMRI technology and all of our cloud-based technologies of storage and intrusion. And Brandeis insists at the time of the framing a far smaller intrusion, the writs of assistance and the general warrants that revealed the diaries of John Wilkes were held to be a violation of the Fourth Amendment. Can it be, he asks, that the Constitution wouldn't provide protection against these even greater intrusions? He's focusing on the value to be protected, not the means of the invasion. And the value is the right of Americans to be protected in our beliefs, thoughts, and emotions and sensations, conferring the right to be let alone, the most comprehensive of right and the right most valued by civilized men. He's really rooting it in the freedom of conscience, which after all was at the heart of the Virginia Bill on religious freedom. The Virginia Bill is if Whitney is Brandeis's greatest achievement, the Virginia Bill is Jefferson's. And the Virginia Bill, better than any other, sums up why freedom of conscience is an unalienable right. This is really significant because it tells us why the Declaration says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, not life, liberty, and property. People have long assumed, in fact, most of the books on the question assume it, that happiness is a synonym for property. Locke, in the second treatise, says that we all have natural rights to life, liberty, and property, and justices and scholars for generations have assumed that the two are synonymous. In fact, Justice Stephen Field, in his Slaughterhouse dissent, assumes that the two are synonymous. They're not. Property is an alienable right. When we move from the state of nature to civil society, we alienate or surrender certain rights in order to get greater security and safety of the rights we've retained. Obviously, property has to be alienable. You have to alienate it in order to exchange it and to buy and sell. And you have to alienate the government to the power to enforce contracts to make us more secure in our property. By contrast, conscience is unalienable because it's rooted in reason. As Jefferson says in the Virginia Bill, that the opinions of men, being dependent on the evidence contemplated by their own minds, cannot be controlled by others. I can't alienate or surrender to you or the government the power to control my thoughts because I can't entirely control them myself. They're the product of my reason. And I can moderate or modulate my initial impulses, but the power to reflect using reason is unalienable because it's inherent in who I am as a human being. Jefferson knows that, as he put it in the Virginia Bill, and that's why he, like all the framers, viewed happiness, unlike property, as an unalienable right. And he was not doing anything original, but just properly channeling natural rights theory by saying that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are unalienable. And Brandeis channels that very precisely in describing the right to be let alone, or the right to be protected in our thoughts, emotions, and sensation as the most comprehensive of rights and the right most valued by civilized men. Again, there's a complete coherence of the moral, intellectual, and constitutional philosophies of Brandeis and Jefferson and of the founding generation in this sense, and it all comes together in Olmsted. One other word about Olmsted and technology. Of course, Brandeis, in his original famous article about the right to privacy, had first grappled with this challenge of translating old rights in light of new technology. He'd been upset by a new technology in the 1890s, the Kodak camera and the instant press, that ensured that what used to be whispered from the closets was now shouted from the rooftops. In particular, it's some mild tabloid items about the wedding breakfast of his law partner, Charles Warren, that so upset Brandeis and Warren that they resolved to look in American law for a legal redress against these indignities. And yet they find none, because American law, unlike Roman law, as they note in their famous article in the Harvard Law Review in 1890, The Right to Privacy, contains no redress for offenses against honor, for dignitary offenses. Roman law and European law allow you to sue for indignities perpetrated by the press or other fellow citizens, but US law doesn't, because it's property-based. It restrains the government from unreasonable searches. It does not restrain fellow citizens from unreasonable insults or invasions. And that's why Brandeis and Warren initially propose a new right, which they root in tort law, against highly offensive or unreasonable invasions of privacy, which they call the right to be let alone. After proposing the right, Brandeis a few years later says, I've reread the article, and he tells Alice, his wife, it's not as good as I thought it was. He becomes increasingly sensitive to the deep conflict between a dignitary right against invasion by fellow citizens and rights of free speech and conscience. And he comes to understand by the time of Whitney that given the clash between the right to think as we will and speak as we think, and the right to be protected against having fellow citizens say nasty things about us, speech should trump dignity and privacy. And he backs away from the tort right he recognized. It's a marvelous example of the depth with which he's grappling with how to balance these competing values, how to ensure that the Constitution and the law protect the same amount of cognitive liberty or intellectual liberty today as they did before new technologies, all of this is deeply relevant to our current grappling in the age of the internet, with questions ranging from the right to be forgotten online to AI. And Brandeis is a model, not for abandoning the text and history of the Constitution, because it's all deeply rooted in these basic founding values of freedom of conscience and freedom of speech, but always insisting that we create a living law that makes these values real in the 21st century. I could continue, but I'd love to take your questions. So let me turn it over to the moderator and have a conversation about the great philosophy of Louis Brandeis. Rhonda, shall I just jump in? I see. I'll start to take these questions.
I'm sorry about that. You can hear me but not see me. So yes, I was supposed to be a little more assertive in this one. So if we could go back for a minute in terms of was Richard's question answered? You don't know.
No question.
Great.
Yeah.
So he was interested in what you were saying about the influence of the classic Greeks on Brandeis. And how was he influenced by, was Brandeis influenced by his Jewish background? How did that compare to Cardoza? And can you talk a little about the commonalities and differences between Cardozo and Brandeis, who are obviously very different, but sometimes get conflated?
Yes, thank you so much, Richard. Obviously a crucial question. It's deeply important to talk about Brandeis's Jewish influences, and he was raised by parents who fled the revolutions of 48 in Europe. They were cultural but not religious Jews. His mother thought that he should be raised with principles of morality and hard work and goodness without being devoted to religious observance. He doesn't reject his Judaism, but he's not religiously observant. However, his most admired relative is his uncle, Louis Dembitz, who's a religious Jew in Louisville and deeply and a committed Zionist. In the one summer early in the 20th century, Brandeis meets Jacob de Haas, the secretary to Theodor Herzl, who says that Louis Dembitz was an admired Jew. And this sparks Brandeis's interest in learning about the connection between his relatives' Zionism and his Judaism. He reads, he studies, as he always does. Then he's really impressed by being a mediator in a strike between Jewish garment workers. And he's so impressed by the intellectualism of the Eastern European immigrants who used their lunch hour to read Tolstoy. And he hadn't met a lot of recent immigrants before. He's a second or third generation immigrant from Central Europe rather than the second wave of immigration in light of the horrific and murderous pogroms of the turn of the 20th century. But he's so impressed by the workers that he thinks and reads and reflects, and he decides to become the greatest Zionist of the early 20th century. And it's Brandeis who organizes the American Zionist movement, that he, money, work, discipline, he raises the money, he helps persuade Woodrow Wilson to accept the Balfour Declaration, and he comes to see in Palestine a vindication of his Jeffersonian ideal of yeoman farmers in an agrarian paradise. And he has a rather idealistic view of Israel as one that's agrarian, democratic, and socialist, in which citizens, through participatory democracy and working with their hands on kibbutzim, will come to achieve Alfred Zimmerman's vision of the perfect citizen in a perfect state. When he visits Israel for the first time, he's just blown away. He says it's like a miniature California, and he's so excited by learning that Alfred Aronson, the great Zionist, introduced a new grain of wheat to Israel, which he says is the greatest service that someone can perform for his country. This is Brandeis's Jewish path, and his Zionism is rooted in his cultural and political and ultimately spiritual identification with the possibility of a Jewish homeland. It's very important, I must stress too, that Brandeis gives urgent speeches about how Jews are not a nation, but a nationality, just like the Irish and the Germans. And he says that every nationality should have its own nation. Every other nationality is the majority in at least one nation in the world. So must the Jewish people be. He doesn't believe that Jews have an obligation to make Aliyah to Israel, but he thinks it is urgently important that there be one nation that represents a Jewish homeland, and that is part of his embrace of the Jewish state. There's more to say, but I think Cardoso is a whole separate interesting
Pretty
question.
good.
I'll leave it at that.
A couple of other questions. One of them is, what do you think he would have thought about the Roberts Court? And what do you think he would have thought about some of the news that's coming out regarding conflicts of interest and things along those lines? No pressure.
I love channeling Brandeis, and the last chapter of the biography has what would Brandeis do? It's kind of presumptuous to sort of take current events stuff and say, well, here's what he'd say. But broadly, Brandeis's philosophy is complicated. He's not a Holmes like always defer to everything guy who would object to every decision to strike down federal and state laws. Because remember, he's with the New Deal majority initially in striking down the centralizing excesses of what he views as the administrative state. So it's to the degree that there's the main reason that the Roberts justices were appointed, starting with Reagan's originalist revolution in 1980, was to rein back the perceived excesses of the Great Society and the New Deal. Brandeis would not have been entirely unsympathetic to that, because he's a Jeffersonian. This is the big point, and I've been looking at how the debate between Hamilton and Jefferson over strict and loose construction and national and state power has defined all of American history. And broadly, there have been waves of Jeffersonian and Hamiltonian justices. Reagan did appoint the current group as Jeffersonians. In fact, Reagan left the Democratic Party because he said it abandoned the principles of Jefferson. And that was the core impulse behind the originalist revolution, reversing the New Deal and Great Society, or at least its excesses, and overturning Roe. And I can't simply, say in a kind of facile way that Brandeis would be totally unsympathetic to all of that. On the other hand, he was a great avatar of the states as laboratories of democracy. He was very into state experimentation. And to the degree that the Roberts Court is second guessing the power of the states, for example, in questions involving religious freedom and campaign finance and so forth, Brandeis might have some questions. More to say, but I'm signaling this just to suggest that there's a more serious division on the Roberts Court between Hamiltonians like Roberts, who's broadly deferential to federal power, including in the most recent voting rights decisions, Shelby County notwithstanding, and at the same time is also wants to preserve state experimentation, as in Roe, and the Jeffersonians who just want to radically strike down, really constrain federal power in a big way, and resurrect doctrines like the independent state legislature doctrine that would allow state legislatures to overturn elections. This is a kind of radical anti-federalism that's Jefferson on steroids, to which Brandeis would be unsympathetic. As to the ethics stuff, all I can say is the obvious. He's so deeply committed to the importance of ethics. He talks about the Jews as a priestly people and says that our values of education and hard work and deep moral commitment to ethics are defining for us, and is so scrupulous about the priestly aspects of the judicial role that the recent controversies would have him appalled. On the other hand, I have to stress, again, it's never easy. There's that great book about the Frankfurter Jefferson connection, and Brandeis is paying Frankfurter to do lobbying for Israel, for a free Palestine throughout his time on the bench. He's paying him a stipend. He's advising Roosevelt from the Oval Office. He's doing stuff that we wouldn't tolerate today because the lines are much stricter. So we shouldn't be too confident that we, it was a completely pure time.
Great. There is another question, a little self-serving. It's for me. And that is about, you've mentioned obviously that Jefferson held slaves and Brandeis definitely knew it. Did he ever affirmatively make a statement about how obviously he disclaims, the fact that Jefferson had slaves? I mean, we want to be able to look back, obviously on the good, but we cannot ignore that. So how did he reconcile that, or did he not?
Brandeis was not a champion of racial equality. He was not a racist. He didn't make disparaging remarks. He had good personal relationship with African Americans and praised Charles Hamilton Houston and other pillars of the NAACP. But he's a Southern Democrat, and I just can't stress enough how deeply embedded white supremacy was in the Democratic Party at the turn of the century. Woodrow Wilson was a racist who resegregated the federal government and installed white supremacy as the essence of federal policy. And Brandeis on the court doesn't say much about race. He doesn't go out of his way to make racist remarks, unlike many of the justices of his era, but he silently joins most of the decisions of his time, most of which are unfavorable to African Americans. And the answer to the question simply is no. He does not call Jefferson out on racism or slavery. He repeatedly calls Jefferson a civilized man without noting that Jefferson's civilized lifestyle was made possible by enslaved labor. It's very striking and very important how Jefferson's hypocrisy on slavery, and basically you can just call it white supremacy, was embedded in the Democratic Party and really in the progressive movement for much of the time that Brandeis was on the bench. His relationship to women's rights was different. He started off not as a huge supporter of women's equality, but comes to be an enthusiastic supporter not only of the 19th Amendment, but also of women's equality, because he surrounds himself with brilliant women, and his secretary and assistant Josephine Goldmark helped write the Brandeis brief in the Mueller case, and I've gotten to know his granddaughters. His daughters he reads to them every day from Greek history at the breakfast table. One becomes a professor and the other a Hadassah activist. Both are deeply scholarly. He really comes to support the education of women on completely equal terms as men. Doesn't happen with African Americans, perhaps because he didn't interact much and didn't have African American clerks and so forth. But that's Brandeis on the question of race.
Great, thank you. I think we have one more question, and it's actually another one of Richard's, which is, did his concept of privacy also embrace physical privacy? People, I'll leave it at that.
Well, definitely in Olmsted, the core of it is physical privacy in the sense of maintaining immunity from unreasonable searches and seizures, and he would have embraced all of the protections of physical trespass and the home is the castle and so forth. But he was also interested in going beyond that when new technology makes it possible to invade our thoughts and sensations and emotions without physical trespass. And that was his insight. It was easy enough for law to maintain protections for physical privacy because all those common law protections were so well rooted. But the challenge was what to do with the non-physical invasions. And that was really his great contribution.
Thank you. Thank you. Then in that case, since I think we've looked at all the questions, I'm going to turn it back to Richard. Thank you very much, Jeffrey.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I didn't realize you were turning it back to me. So thank you, Rhonda. So I just want, first of all, thank you, Jeff, Professor Rosen, for as always, a brilliant sweeping presentation. I know that along with everyone else, I have much more educated about Justice Brandeis, and I'm personally fascinated to have heard your response to my question about his Jewish identity and to learn about his Zionist roots, which we know of with respect to Justice Cardozo, but that Justice Brandeis was outspoken on that as well is really a fascinating insight. Thank you. So I want to just take a moment to invite folks, if you're fascinated by this program, if you want to, we do often do webinars on many other important issues. We've been doing regular series of webinars on, for instance, lawyers who are suing what I would call the bad guys, you know, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran. You don't have to identify yourself with my characterization, Professor Rosen, but just to say, there are lawyers that are trying to do justice and vindicate victims of bad acts by very foreign countries, and we have webinars on those issues on a regular basis, on much else as well. So if you'd like to learn more about AAJLJ, please take a look at AAJLJ.org. We welcome your input, your membership, your support, and we want to continue to put on important programs like this one. So I'll finish then by saying thank you to Rhonda for moderating. Thank you to JAHM and to its representative, Mr. Hoffman, for joining us at the beginning. We're really excited to have been part of this partnership. And thank you to those who joined in. And most of all, thank you, Jeffrey Rosen, for this insightful and terrific presentation. We hope to continue to draw on your expertise in the future and have other such opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you.
And if you see, Jeffrey, just before you do, information about JAHM and AAJLJ is in the chat. Jeffrey, take it away.
Thanks to you all. Please also check out the National Constitution Center, the great friend of JAHM, and our amazing website, constitutioncenter.org. 70 million hits since we launched, among the most Googled constitutions in the world. And it's just this feast of free resources, including the weekly podcast that I host, We the People, which bring together liberals and conservatives, the resources for kids, including a new Constitution 101 class with Khan Academy, and the great convenings with adults. So we'd love to do lots with you and with all of our friends to spread the light about the Constitution. And let's always be inspired by Justice Brandeis. There he is right behind me. He's always not smiling, but soberly looking down at me and inspiring industry and self-improvement and all of our efforts to create a more perfect union. So thanks to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm just going to add in a couple quick things. I'm Alyssa Gresh, the Director of Programming, for those of you who don't know me. Thank you to everybody, and please consider joining the AAJLJ, of course. And next month, we are going to have some CLEs available as per very popular request. So the first of those is June 18th. So please stay tuned for more programming. And again, please join us. And thank you to Jeffrey Rosen and to our moderator and Richard, of course. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.